The chalk dust settled in the dim lecture hall of the Sorbonne on November 17, 1891, and Professor Henry Fontaine's hand froze mid-gesture. Behind him, someone had altered his equation. Not vandalized, corrected. The modification was so elegant, so impossibly sophisticated, that for a moment he wondered if another faculty member had slipped in during the break. But when he turned, scanning the rows of empty wooden benches still warm from departed students, he found only a cleaning woman gathering rags near the door, and beside her, a small girl in a threadbare dress staring at the blackboard with dark, unblinking eyes. The child couldn't have been more than 9 years old. She had chalk dust on her fingertips. Professor Fontaine felt his pulse quicken. The solution she'd written used a mathematical approach that wouldn't be formally theorized for another 30 years. Within a week, that girl would vanish from Paris. Within a month, every record of her existence would be systematically destroyed. The Catholic Church would classify documents related to her case as secretum omega. The Vatican archives contain a suspicious 3-month gap in 1891, where all Parisian parish records simply ceased to exist. What happened in that lecture hall didn't just threaten one man's reputation. It threatened the entire foundation of who was allowed to possess knowledge, and the lengths institutions would go to protect that hierarchy. November had arrived cold and wet in Paris that year, the kind of damp that seeped through wool and settled in bones. Marguerite Lefevre, a widow of 34, worked as a laundress, her hands perpetually red and cracked from lye soap. She had one daughter named Marie, born out of wedlock in 1882 to a father Marguerite never named. In a society that measured a woman's worth by her husband's name, this was a mark of deep shame. Marguerite worked 14-hour days to keep them fed, scrubbing floors at the university when cleaning positions opened. Marie, small for her age with dark eyes that seemed too large for her thin face, had never attended school. Education for illegitimate daughters of laundresses was not a priority of the Third Republic. According to testimony given later by their landlord, Marie was unnaturally quiet, always watching, always thinking about something no one else could see. He remembered once finding her arranging dried beans on the floor in complex patterns. When he asked what she was doing, she'd said simply, "Counting the shapes between the shapes." He thought it was the nonsense of a strange child. He hadn't understood she was calculating geometric principles. On the evening of November 16th, Marguerite received word that the university needed emergency cleaning. The pay was triple the usual rate, but it meant working overnight. She had no one to leave Marie with. Marguerite made a decision that would alter the course of her daughter's life and end her own. She brought Marie with her to the Sorbonne. The Sorbonne at night was a different creature. Gaslights flickered in sconces along stone corridors that had stood for centuries, casting shadows that seemed to move with their own intelligence. Marguerite's shoes squeaked on marble floors as she pushed her cleaning cart, Marie following silently behind like a small ghost. They reached the mathematics lecture hall around 9 in the evening. Professor Henry Fontaine had been working late preparing his lecture. According to his own later testimony, he left the hall around 9:30 to retrieve additional books from his office. The blackboard bore his current obsession, an equation related to what would later be known as the Riemann hypothesis, an unsolved problem that had frustrated mathematicians since 1859. Marguerite entered the empty hall and began her work. Marie sat on the front bench, swinging her legs, watching her mother work. Then the girl's attention drifted to the blackboard. A janitor named Thomas Mercier would later tell a journalist that he'd been passing in the corridor when he heard the scrape of chalk on slate. He'd glanced through the door's window and seen the small girl standing on a bench, reaching up to write on the blackboard, her hand moving with strange confidence. He thought nothing of it at the time. Children drew on things. When Professor Fontaine returned at 10:15, his arms full of leather-bound volumes, he nearly dropped them. The equation had been transformed. Someone had added 3 lines of notation beneath his original work, using a technique that combined number theory with what appeared to be an intuitive grasp of complex analysis. The handwriting was uncertain, childish even, but the mathematical reasoning was pristine, revolutionary. Who did this? His voice cracked. Marguerite Lefevre rose from where she'd been scrubbing, her face going pale. Monsieur le Professeur, I apologize, my daughter, she sometimes touches things, I will clean it. Your daughter? Fontaine's eyes found Marie, still standing on the bench, chalk in hand. This child wrote this. Marie looked at him without speaking. In his testimony, Fontaine described her expression as disturbingly calm, as though she had done nothing more remarkable than tying her shoe. Can you tell me what you wrote? Marie glanced at the board, then back at him. The spaces were wrong. You were trying to count things that don't have edges, but you gave them edges. I fixed the spaces. Fontaine felt sweat prickle along his collar despite the room's chill. Where did you learn mathematics? I didn't learn it, it's just there, like seeing. Marguerite rushed forward, grabbing her daughter's arm, but Fontaine held up a hand. Your daughter, has she had any education, any tutoring? She can't read, monsieur. We have no money for school. The professor stared at the blackboard, then at the small girl in her patched dress. She can't read, but she can do this. He turned to face Marguerite fully. Madame Lefevre, I need to test her. With your permission, this could be extraordinary. Fontaine spent the next hour writing problems on the blackboard, while Marie sat on the bench, occasionally glancing at the equations. She solved a theorem related to prime distribution that had been unsolved for 40 years. She corrected an error in Fontaine's own published paper from 1888, an error no reviewer had caught. She developed an alternative proof for Euler's identity, using a method that seemed to emerge fully formed from her mind. When Fontaine asked her to explain her reasoning, she struggled. The numbers want to go certain ways, I just let them. By midnight, Professor Fontaine was packing like a man possessed. Madame Lefevre, your daughter may be one of the most profound mathematical minds in Europe. I need to present her to the faculty. With your permission, I'd like to arrange for her to demonstrate her abilities to my colleagues. Marguerite's hands twisted in her apron. Would this help her, monsieur? Could she attend school? School? Madame, if what I've witnessed tonight can be verified, your daughter could be admitted to the university itself. That word, unprecedented. Marguerite would remember it later, would realize too late that unprecedented meant threatening, meant dangerous, meant a disruption to an order that powerful people had spent centuries building. But in that moment, she said yes. The demonstration was scheduled for November 19th. Professor Fontaine assembled a panel of 7 mathematicians and university administrators to witness what he promised would be a revelation that will reshape our understanding of intellectual capacity. Among those invited was Father Philippe Moreau, a Jesuit priest and theologian who held an advisory position at the Sorbonne. His presence would prove catastrophic. On November 19th at 2 in the afternoon, Marguerite brought Marie to the university. The girl wore her only good dress, dark blue wool that Marguerite had stayed up all night mending. The lecture hall held 8 men seated in a semicircle, their faces ranging from curious to skeptical. Professor Fontaine stood at the front, visibly nervous. Gentlemen, what you are about to witness will challenge every assumption you hold about intelligence and human potential. I present to you Marie Lefevre, aged 9. The child has never attended school. She cannot read or write, and yet 3 nights ago she corrected an error in my work that has eluded professional mathematicians for decades. Murmurs rippled through the assembled men. Marie, would you approach the board? The small girl walked forward, her footsteps barely audible. She climbed onto the chair Fontaine had positioned, took a piece of chalk, and began to work. The room fell silent except for the scrape of chalk and the hiss of gas lamps. Marie worked for 23 minutes. She solved all 3 problems. At one point she paused, stared at an equation, and said, "This one is sad. It's trying to be infinite, but it's trapped in being finite." She adjusted the equation in a way that somehow captured exactly what she meant. The mathematician sat transfixed. When Marie finished, she climbed down and returned to her mother's side. The silence stretched. Finally, Professor Dreyfus spoke. "Impossible. The child must have been trained. Someone taught her this." Fontaine shook his head vigorously. "There is no education, no tutoring, no access to mathematical texts." Then how does an illiterate child from the slums demonstrate mastery that rivals our most accomplished scholars? Another professor demanded. I don't know, that's precisely why I called you here. Understand what? Father Morrow's voice cut through the room like a blade. All eyes turned to him. The Jesuit priest stood slowly, his black cassock rustling. What you are suggesting, Henry, is that this child possesses knowledge without learning, knowledge without education. Knowledge that appears in her mind as though placed there by what source? Fontaine blinked, confused. I don't understand your meaning, Father. Don't you? Mara walked toward the blackboard, examining Marie's work. The Church has encountered such phenomena before. Individuals who claim to possess knowledge beyond their station, beyond their capacity, beyond what God has ordained for them. We have words for such things. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Father, surely you're not suggesting. I am suggesting nothing yet. I am observing. Morrow turned to face Marie directly. Child, when you solve these problems, do you hear voices? No. Do you see visions? No. Then how does the knowledge come to you? Marie considered this. It's like when you're hungry, you know you're hungry. You don't have to learn it. You just know. The numbers are like that. Morrow's expression hardened. The Church teaches us that knowledge comes through learning, through transmission from teacher to student, a chain reaching back to God Himself. What you describe is knowledge without transmission. That is theologically problematic. He looked back at Fontaine. This child is either a miracle or an abomination. We must determine which. The meeting dissolved into tense debate. Fontaine argued passionately that Marie must be studied and nurtured, but Father Morrow was unmoved. I must consult with my superiors before any decision is made. The Church has a responsibility to investigate claims of supernatural ability. I will need access to the girl for questioning. My daughter is not on trial, Father, Marguerite said, her voice small but firm. Is she not? You bring a child of uncertain parentage, unschooled. She was baptized. I have the certificate, a certificate I will need to verify. Morrow made a note in a small leather book. I will also need to examine your family history, Madame Lefebvre, to ensure there is no history of witchcraft or heresy. The word hung in the air like poison. Marguerite felt her legs weaken. Father, this is 1891, not the Middle Ages, Fontaine protested. I suggest nothing. I investigate. That is my role. The girl will remain with her mother for now, but neither of them is to leave Paris without my permission. He swept from the room. In his wake, the remaining professors sat in stunned silence. The next morning, two men in dark suits appeared at Marguerite's door, identifying themselves as representatives of the Archbishop's office. They needed to ask questions about Marie. The girl was not home. Marguerite had sent Marie to spend the day with a former co-worker named Isabelle. The men found Isabelle within the hour. When she refused to hand over the child without the mother present, one of them told her, "You are interfering with a church investigation. There are consequences for that." That evening, Isabelle told Marguerite what had happened. I've heard stories about children the church takes an interest in. They don't always come back to their families. If your daughter really can do what they say, she's a threat to them, and they eliminate threats. Marguerite wanted to dismiss this as paranoia, but she had seen Father Morrow's eyes. That night, listening to her daughter breathe in the darkness, she made a decision. They would leave Paris, but leaving required money, and money required time. She thought she had a week to gather funds. She was wrong. Professor Fontaine came to her apartment on November 21st, his face haggard. Father Morrow has filed an official inquiry with the Archbishop. He claims that Marie's abilities are evidence of demonic influence. He is pushing for an exorcism. Marguerite's hand flew to her mouth. I've been conducting research into historical cases like this, Fontaine continued. In 1643, a girl named Clothilde from Rouen demonstrated the ability to calculate astronomical positions without training. The church investigated her. She was declared possessed. She died during the fourth exorcism ritual. In 1721, a boy named Etienne from Lyon displayed the ability to speak Latin without learning it. He was taken into church custody. He was never seen again. He pulled an envelope from his coat. I have a colleague in Lyon who runs a small private school. He would take Marie, no questions asked. You could take her there tonight if possible. If I run, they'll know something is wrong. If you stay, they'll take her anyway. At least if you run, you have a chance." He pressed the envelope into her hands. "She's extraordinary, madame, and they will kill her for it if they can." After Fontaine left, Marguerite began to pack. They would leave for Lyon on November 23rd. She needed 2 days to collect wages owed to her. She thought 2 days would be enough. They weren't. On the morning of November 22nd, Father Moreau came with 6 men. Marguerite and Marie were at the market. Their neighbor met them in the street, his face pale. "Madame, don't go up. Men are in your room searching." The priest said if I saw you, I was to tell you that you are required to bring the girl to the archbishop's residence immediately. He said refusing would be considered evidence of guilt. In that moment, standing on a dirty Paris street with her daughter's hand in hers, Marguerite made the most important decision of her life. "Marie, we're going on a trip, right now." They did not go back to the apartment. They walked straight to Gare de Lyon. Marguerite had only 12 francs in her pocket, enough for tickets to Dijon. They boarded a train that departed at noon. As it pulled away from Paris, Marguerite held her daughter and prayed. In the archbishop's residence, Father Moreau received word that the Lefevres had fled. He showed no emotion. He simply dispatched telegrams to parishes throughout France. A woman of 34, plain, with red hands. A girl of 9, small, dark-eyed. Anyone who saw them was to report immediately to church authorities. The hunt had begun. For 3 days, Marguerite and Marie stayed ahead of the search. They took a room in Dijon, and Marguerite found work washing dishes. But on November 25th, Marie fell ill with fever. A doctor named Dr. Pascal diagnosed pneumonia. The girl needed medicine that cost 6 francs. Marguerite had 4. Dr. Pascal provided the medicine on credit. While treating Marie, he asked questions. Marguerite, exhausted and terrified, told him they had left Paris because powerful people wanted to take her daughter. Dr. Pascal frowned but didn't press. On November 28th, a priest from the local parish came to visit Dr. Pascal. The archbishop's office was searching for a woman and her daughter. Had the doctor treated anyone matching their description? Dr. Pascal believed in the sanctity of the doctor-patient relationship. He refused to discuss his patients. The priest left unsatisfied. That evening, Dr. Pascal warned Marguerite, "You need to leave Dijon. They're looking for you and they're not going to stop." He gave her an address, a farm owned by his sister, and 20 francs from his own pocket. "Stay there until the search passes. Your daughter is special. Whatever gifts she has, they're worth protecting." On November 29th, Marguerite and Marie reached the farm. Dr. Pascal's sister, Emilie Bonnet, welcomed them with wary kindness. For 6 days they hid there. Marie recovered her strength. Marguerite began to hope. Perhaps they were far enough from Paris. Perhaps the church had given up. On December 5th, that hope died. 3 men arrived at the farm in the afternoon. 2 wore dark suits. The third was Father Moreau himself. They had been methodical, questioning every doctor in Dijon. When Dr. Pascal continued to refuse information, they had threatened him with losing his medical license. He had broken. He gave them his sister's address. When Moreau knocked on the farmhouse door, Emilie's husband Thomas, a large man who had worked his farm for 40 years, tried to stop them. One of the men produced a warrant from the archbishop. "This gives us authority anywhere in France. Step aside." In the barn, Marguerite heard voices raised. She looked at Marie and made a calculation. The barn had a back door leading to the fields. If they ran now, they might reach the woods. "Marie, we're going to run. When I say go, you run as fast as you can toward the trees." They slipped out the back. They made it perhaps 50 meters before they heard shouts. Marguerite ran, pulling Marie along, her lungs burning. The woods were so close. A hand grabbed Marguerite's shoulder and yanked her backward. She fell hard. Marie screamed and tried to run, but one of the suited men caught her easily, lifting her off the ground. Father Moreau walked up slowly. He looked at Marguerite sprawled on the ground, then at Marie struggling in the man's grip. "This flight ends now. Bring the child, leave the mother." "No." Marguerite lunged toward her daughter. The second man grabbed her, holding her back. "You have no right. She's my daughter. She is a soul in peril, and the church has the obligation to intervene." Moreau's voice was cold, clinical. "You are a poor influence. an unwed mother who has filled the child's head with unnatural ideas. You will not see her again until we have determined whether she can be saved." The man began carrying Marie toward a carriage. Marie's screams echoed across the fields. "Mama, Mama!" Marguerite fought like an animal until the man holding her struck her across the face. She fell, tasting blood. From the ground, she watched the carriage door close on her daughter's terrified face. She watched it drive away. The last thing she heard was Marie's voice growing fainter. "Mama!" Father Moreau looked down at Marguerite crumpled on the frozen ground. "You are fortunate, madame. I could have you arrested. Instead, I will give you a chance at redemption. Return to Paris. Confess your sins. Pray for your daughter's soul. If the girl can be cleansed and if you demonstrate genuine repentance, you may see her again. Possibly." He turned and walked toward the carriage. Emily and Thomas ran from the farmhouse too late. They found Marguerite on the ground, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe, her hands clawing at the dirt as though she could dig her way to her daughter through the earth itself. The carriage carrying Marie disappeared over the horizon. That was December 5, 1891. After that date, no verified record exists of Marie Lefevre. She was not returned to her mother. She did not appear in any church, orphanage, or school. She simply vanished as thoroughly as if she had never existed. But other people were paying attention. Professor Fontaine, when he learned what had happened, demanded information about Marie's whereabouts. His letters were ignored. He published an article describing Marie's abilities and condemning the church's intervention. The article was pulled from circulation within a week. By March 1892, Fontaine had resigned from the Sorbonne under pressure. A journalist named Claude Mercier became interested in the case. He interviewed everyone he could find. Marguerite, who had returned to Paris, her hands now shaking constantly. Dr. Pascal, consumed by guilt. Emily and Thomas, who had been visited twice more by church officials and told that discussing the matter would result in charges. Fontaine, who provided his notes from the demonstration. Mercier assembled a picture of what had happened, but when he tried to publish his findings, every newspaper refused. Finally, a small radical paper agreed to run the piece in July 1892. The edition sold out immediately, but the church responded swiftly. The paper's editor was arrested. The paper was shut down. Mercier was warned that continuing to investigate would be considered incitement against the church, a crime carrying a prison sentence. He stopped investigating. Marguerite Lefevre never saw her daughter again. She spent the rest of her life searching, writing letters to every church authority, visiting convents and orphanages, asking every priest if they knew what happened to a girl named Marie, 9 years old, brilliant beyond measure. No one knew, or no one would say. In 1897, 6 years after Marie's disappearance, Marguerite died. The cause was listed as pneumonia, but those who knew her said it was grief. She was buried in a pauper's grave in Père Lachaise Cemetery. There is no marker. Professor Fontaine died in 1904, estranged from academia. His papers were burned after his death. Father Moreau continued his work for 20 more years, eventually becoming a bishop. He died in 1912. His obituary praised his dedication to protecting the faith from corruption. He never spoke publicly about Marie Lefevre. Marie's case was not isolated. When you dig into church archives and university records, you find a pattern. In 1847, a girl named Sophie from Marseille demonstrated the ability to solve complex engineering problems despite no formal education. She was investigated by church authorities for 3 months and then disappeared from all records. In 1862, a boy named Jacques from Toulouse showed a preternatural understanding of astronomy. He was taken into church care for spiritual assessment. No further record exists. In 1878, a girl named Françoise from Bordeaux began speaking fluent Greek despite never learning it. A priest declared her possessed. She was subjected to exorcism rituals. She survived but was left mentally incapacitated. These cases span decades. They cross geographic boundaries. They all share common elements. Young people, often children, poor families with no social power, knowledge or abilities unexplained by conventional education, all targeted by the church as threats. Why were these children so dangerous? The answer lies in understanding what they represented. In the 19th century, European society was built on rigid hierarchies. The church and aristocracy maintained power by controlling access to knowledge. Universities existed to train the sons of wealthy families to perpetuate that power structure. The idea that knowledge could appear spontaneously, that a laundress's daughter could demonstrate mathematical genius rivaling trained professors, this was not just unusual, it was revolutionary. It suggested that intelligence and worth were not determined by birth or wealth or access to institutions. It suggested that the hierarchies were arbitrary, that power structures were fragile, that the order of the world was a choice rather than a divine mandate. If that was true, then everything collapsed. If a 9-year-old girl with no education could solve problems stumping professors, what did that say about the value of those professors' positions? What did it say about universities that charged enormous fees and admitted only the elite? What did it say about a church claiming to be the sole conduit of divine wisdom? These children were not just individuals. They were existential threats to the system itself. And the system responded the way threatened systems always respond, with violence, with erasure, with systematic elimination of the threat. In 1893, 2 years after Marie disappeared, a confidential memo was circulated among church officials in France. The memo, which surfaced in the 1960s when a portion of Vatican archives was declassified, discussed the problem of spontaneous knowledge. It used coded language, but the meaning was clear. Children who demonstrated abilities beyond their station were to be identified, investigated, and managed to prevent disruption to social order. The memo specified that such children were not to be celebrated or studied but contained. The methods suggested included placement in church-run institutions where they could be monitored, re-education to suppress their abilities, or, in extreme cases, permanent removal from society. This was not the work of a few zealous priests. This was policy. Marie Lefebvre was caught in that machinery. So what happened to her? We don't know for certain, but there are clues. In 1894, 3 years after Marie's disappearance, a small convent in Brittany, convent of Saint Marie des Anges, recorded the arrival of a new resident listed only as M, age uncertain, ward of the church, special case. The notation specified she was to have no contact with the outside world and was to be kept in seclusion. A nun named Sister Therese wrote a letter in 1903 to her sister, discovered in a private collection in 1987. Sister Therese mentioned a girl who had been at the convent years earlier, kept in a locked room and forbidden from speaking. She wrote, she would scratch mathematical symbols into the walls of her cell with her fingernails. We were instructed to whitewash the walls every week to erase them, but she would simply begin again. After 2 years, she stopped. They said she had been cured. I think they broke her. The girl was released from the convent in 1896 and was reportedly placed with a family in the countryside to work as a servant. No name was recorded. The convent of Saint Marie des Anges burned down in 1902. All its records were destroyed. Whether that girl was Marie Lefebvre cannot be proven definitively, but the timing matches, the age matches, the description of mathematical symbols scratched into walls matches. If that girl was Marie, then she lived the rest of her life in obscurity, her genius erased, her identity stolen, her potential crushed. She would have been in her 20s in 1896, released into a world that had no place for her, with no education, no family, no resources. She likely lived and died in poverty, her name forgotten, her contributions to mathematics erased from history, and that erasure was intentional. When Claude Mercier tried to investigate, he went to Saint-Étienne-du-Mont to access Marie's baptismal records. The church secretary told him the records from 1882 had been damaged in a flood and were no longer legible. Mercier visited the archives of Paris, which kept duplicates. The archives had a 3-month gap in 1891, where records from multiple parishes were simply missing. No explanation was provided. A clerk who had worked there for 30 years told him off the record that in early 1892, men from the church had come with an official request to examine records related to irregular baptisms. They had taken documents away for verification. Those documents were never returned. Marie's baptismal record, along with records of dozens of other children, had been removed from public archives. It was as though she had never been born. This was not accidental. This was systematic historical erasure. The church, faced with the problem of Marie Lefevre, did not simply take her. They removed all proof that she had existed. They did this because her existence was dangerous. Her existence was a story that could inspire others, could make poor families believe their children could be more, could undermine the social order. So they didn't just silence Marie, they silenced her story. But they couldn't erase everyone's memory. Marguerite remembered, Fontaine remembered, Dr. Pascal remembered, the nuns remembered, Mercier remembered. And they left traces, fragments of testimony, letters hidden in attics, notes tucked into archives. Over decades and centuries, those fragments have been pieced together by historians who believe that erased stories deserve to be recovered. What emerges is not just the story of one girl. It's the story of a system that was willing to destroy children to preserve its power. It's the story of a church that claimed to value human souls while systematically crushing human potential. It's the story of a society so fragile, so terrified of its own hierarchies being questioned, that it could not allow a 9-year-old girl to solve math problems. Think about that. A child corrected an equation and the response was to hunt her down, rip her from her mother's arms, lock her away, and erase her from history. Not because she had committed a crime, not because she had harmed anyone, but because her existence contradicted the lie that only certain people, born into certain families with access to certain institutions, could possess knowledge and value. Marie Lefevre's crime was being brilliant while poor, being female while gifted, being uncontrolled while powerful. And for that she was destroyed. You might be thinking, this was the 19th century. Things are different now. Are you sure? In 2019, a study found that gifted students from low-income families are significantly less likely to be identified for gifted programs than their wealthy peers, even when test scores are identical. The system still filters access to knowledge based on wealth. In 2023, journalists uncovered that several prestigious universities had been systematically rejecting applicants with exceptional abilities if they came from families that couldn't afford full tuition. The system still controls who gets to demonstrate knowledge. The mechanisms have changed. We don't lock children in convents anymore, but we track them out of advanced classes. We deny them resources. We bury them under student debt. We create barriers that are less visible but just as effective. And when someone from the wrong background achieves something that threatens the hierarchy, the system still responds. Not with priests and carriages, but with funding cuts and hearing biases and institutional barriers designed to eliminate the threat. Marie Lefevre's story is not a historical curiosity. It's a blueprint. It's a warning about what institutions do when their power is threatened. It's a reminder that the systems we live in were built by people who benefit from them, and those people will fight to maintain that benefit. Right now, there are children who could change the world if given the chance. There are brilliant minds trapped in poverty, in neighborhoods without resources, in families without access. There are potential mathematicians and scientists and artists who will never be discovered because the system is designed to prevent their discovery. They are the modern Maries, and we are the ones deciding whether to let them be erased or to fight for them. Today, you didn't just watch a video. You witnessed the testimony of an erased life. Marie Lefevre was 9 years old when powerful men decided her brilliance was too dangerous to exist. They took her from her mother's arms. They locked her away. They broke her mind. They erased her name from every record they could reach. And they did it because her existence threatened their comfortable lives. You now know what they tried to hide. A laundress's daughter who never attended a day of school solved mathematical problems that stumped professors. And for that achievement, she paid with her freedom, her future, and possibly her life. If this makes you angry, if this makes you want to scream at the injustice, then channel that rage into action. Hit the like button because it's an act of defiance. Every like is a refusal to let Marie stay erased. Every share is a rebellion against the systems that tried to bury her. Write in the comments, Marie deserved better. 3 words. Simple. But they matter, because Marie's story was silenced once. We won't let it be silenced again. Subscribe to this channel because Marie is not the only one. There are other stories, other names, other lives that powerful institutions have tried to erase from history. Stories of women scientists whose discoveries were stolen. Stories of indigenous scholars whose knowledge was dismissed. Stories of working-class inventors locked out of patent systems. Stories of children who were too brilliant, too questioning, too dangerous to the established order. I'm bringing those stories back, one at a time. And I can't do it alone. I need you to be part of this. We cannot change what happened to Marie. We cannot give her back her life or her mother or her genius, but we can refuse to let her disappear. We can say her name, Marie Lefebvre, daughter of Marguerite, 9 years old. Brilliant, stolen, not forgotten. They wanted you to never know this, but now you know. Now the power is in your hands. Share this story. Make people uncomfortable. Make them question what other stories have been buried. And ask yourself, if you had been there in Paris in 1891, would you have fought for Marie? You can't answer that question about the past, but you can answer it about the present, because there are Maries right now. Children who need people to fight for them, systems that need to be challenged. Will you stay silent, or will you fight?